Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great event on tap, and I'm really excited about this topic today. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items we need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on demand. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we will try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. Also happening at the end of today's webinar, we will be doing a drawing for 6 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 6 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's kick off today's webinar, which is 5 Kubernetes security tools you should use. Our speakers today are Joe Pelletier, who is VP of Product at Fairwinds, and Robert Brennan, who is a Director of Open Source at Fairwinds. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me today. Welcome to today's webinar.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you and put myself on mute and let you get right to it.
Excellent. Thanks again. So it's exciting to be here today to talk to everyone about 5 security tools you should use. In terms of today's agenda, we wanted to cover a few different topics. The first is just a highlight of the common security challenges with Kubernetes today. And then we wanted to spend some time going into the 5 different security tools and concepts that are important to consider as you move into your Kubernetes journey. And we'll touch upon a little bit of the benefits of an emerging category called Kubernetes configuration validation. Then we'll leave some time for Q&A. So moving on to the next slide, we will wanted to first just talk a little bit about what are some of the top challenges today in the Kubernetes and container landscape. And recently, the CNCF conducted a survey that actually polled enterprises and many companies around what their top challenges are in using and deploying containers. And as you can see, security resonates as one of the top 3 challenges. In addition to that, it's that cultural shift of moving to containers in Kubernetes, which means that developers, DevOps, and security teams are all going to have to learn some new concepts and learn new technologies in order to deliver applications quicker and faster to customers. With the move to containers in Kube, there's also a lot of complexity that comes into play. And we're hoping today, from a security perspective, to kind of talk through some of those concepts and challenges to make it easier to apply really great security best practices. If we move on to the next slide, we're going to kind of focus on a few different areas. One is really the challenge of how do you maintain consistent and secure deployments. Deployments are really the way that in Kubernetes that describe how that container should run, and there's a variety of different types of security settings that can go along with that. The second is this ongoing challenge of balancing development velocity and time to market with that need for security. And because Kubernetes is something that runs your containers in production, being able to ensure that applications can still be deployed quickly and you have the great operational security in place, balancing that is always an important challenge. And the third area is going to be learning new best practices and new tools that you can use and deploy today so that you can stay up to date on some of the security best practices. So let's go take a look at the 5 different areas that we'll be covering. The first area are going to be around ingress policies. And really, we're going to show you some technical examples on how to prevent and mitigate denial of service attacks with those policies. The second is going to be role-based access controls, or RBAC. We're going to walk through a couple of those examples, followed by network policies and container security and configuration validation. So hopefully this gives you a good preview in terms of what we'll be covering today. And on the next slide, you'll see that for some of the content, we'll actually be covering specific configuration examples that you can use to configure Kubernetes to be secure, and providing you with some demos of popular security tools that you can try today. So a lot of great content that we'll be covering over the next half hour or so. Let's move on to the first topic. And really, this first topic is around Kubernetes Ingress policies for denial of service protection. Now, when it comes to Kubernetes, we know that it's a great platform for scaling up and down containers in response to traffic and demand on your application. One of the great benefits of Kubernetes is that ability to scale quickly and ensure that you are providing great availability for your applications to end customers. But ultimately, if there's an attack against your application, that's where having the inability to mitigate that attack can cause you to consume unnecessary compute resources. Now, this is a common problem. This isn't the first time that we've all had to deal with denial of service challenges. And there's a great first line of defense with denial of service providers like Cloudflare and CloudFront. But a really good second line of defense is ensuring that your Kubernetes Ingress policy is configured to help mitigate some of these same risks. And I'm going to turn it over to Robert, my colleague here, to talk through some technical examples of how you can configure your Kubernetes Ingress policy.
Yes, so we have an example here from Nginx Ingress, which is probably one of the more common and one of the simpler Ingress providers within Kubernetes. And you can see Nginx Ingress provides a lot of different options available to limit the number of incoming connections from a given IP address, the request per second, request per minute. You can set limits on the body size of any particular request. And this can be tuned by host name, by path. You really have a lot of fine-grained control over how Nginx Ingress is going to handle rate limiting. If you want to use something a little more complex like Istio, it also has a lot of options here for doing rate limiting, making sure that you're guarded against these kinds of denial of service attacks. The one caution I'll give is that it's important to look through the documentation for each of these tools to understand how these flags are working. In particular, Nginx Ingress, these flags are set once per Nginx pod. So if your Ingress is scaled up very heavily, these limits end up getting multiplied out actually by the number of pods. So it's important to understand, exactly the limitations of the particular Ingress add-on that you're using.
Awesome, thanks, Robert. The second area that we want to cover is role-based access control, also known as RBAC. Now, when it comes to Kubernetes, sometimes the easiest way to deploy a new app is really by just giving away as much administrative permission as possible. You run into fewer issues when you give away more permission. But what that also means is that an application can access logs, secrets, delete resources, and potentially escalate permissions if you give away too much access. And this is especially important if you have an application that doesn't need extensive control over your cluster, but you're ultimately giving it keys to access a lot of different resources within that cluster. So in general, the best practice here is to follow the security concept of least privilege. And there's actually a variety of ways you can apply good RBAC policies. We'll show you one tool today as part of a demo. But first, let's walk through some of the technical configuration with Robert on how that works.
Yes, so there are a few different concepts that are necessary to understand for implementing RBAC in Kubernetes. At the top level, we have service accounts and users, where users generally represent an actual person who might be interacting with your cluster, and service accounts represent applications or automated applications that are going to be interfacing with the Kubernetes API. Once we have those defined, we're going to use roles to spec out a list of things that a person with that role might be allowed to do, and then role bindings, which basically link users and service accounts with particular roles. We can also use cluster roles and cluster role bindings to apply the same types of rules across the entire cluster rather than to a specific namespace. If we just use roles and role bindings, those permissions are going to be scoped to a specific namespace. So in this example that we have here, we have a role that will allow anybody with this role to get, watch, and list any pods that are in this default namespace. And then with the role binding, we are actually saying that user Jane should get this pod reader role. So once this role binding is created, Jane will be able to get, watch, and list pods. Now that can be kind of complex when you have 3 different objects that need to be created for any particular person to be able to get permissions. So there is an open source project provided by Fairwinds called RBAC Manager, which allows you to simplify this process a little bit more. Specifically, it allows you to specify several role bindings for a particular user or service account within the same CRD, the same YAML file. So you can see here, we're granting Joe access to both the view cluster role and the edit cluster role in the API and the web namespaces, respectively. So this just makes it a little easier, a little simpler to manage a bunch of different RBAC roles all being attached to the same user. And I can bring up a quick demo of RBAC Manager so y'all can see what that is actually like. So I have RBAC Manager is not installed yet, so I can helm install RBAC Manager. Make sure it's ready. A second. All right, there it is. I can create a new namespace called MyApp. And I'm going to check if this user can list pods in MyApp. And you can see using this kubectl auth CANI, we can check if this service account MyApp is allowed to list pods in MyApp. And it replied, no, it's not allowed to. You can see it actually returned a status code or an exit code. It's non-zero to let me know. I can check out this RBAC definition that I've created that will give the service account MyApp. It will bind it to the view cluster role in the MyApp namespace. This is a built-in cluster role in Kubernetes that allows you to view basic things, pretty much everything other than secrets. And we've bound it to the namespace MyApp. So if I apply this RBAC definition, should be able to run that CANI again. And now you can see I'm allowed to list pods as this service account. So in the background, what's happened is RBAC Manager has created a service account for MyApp, and it has created a role binding from that MyApp service account to the namespace where I want to list pods.
Awesome. That's a great demo, Robert. Thanks for sharing that. The third tool that we want to be able to, tool and concept that we want to be able to talk about today is network policy. And network policy, it's actually similar to RBAC in the sense that it's deciding who has access to which resources in your cluster. In this case, network policy actually focuses on who can talk to what resources in your cluster. So similar concept as RBAC, but really more about who can talk to what resources. And in a large enterprise, it might mean that dozens of applications may run inside the same Kubernetes cluster. And by default, every application may have network access to each other. But of course, you want to be able to limit that access in various different ways. And so network policy can allow you to configure which workloads are allowed to talk to which other resources, such as databases. So for example, maybe there's a database that only a set number of workloads are allowed to talk to. A network policy would allow you to put that limit in place. One of the things that network policy is important to consider is when you go in to build a Kubernetes cluster, you don't need to actually enable this. It's not a requirement. So it's generally something that folks don't do on day one when they're building their cluster. But it's also an important security consideration after the fact as you go and build out your topology and add more services, figuring out what are the ways I can limit which service talks to which. And so in this example, I'm going to ask Robert to walk through some of the configuration, really a basic example that illustrates how a network policy can be configured and implemented in Kubernetes.
Yeah, so here we see a network policy object for Kubernetes, which is going to basically allow this pod only to access a particular set of IP addresses within our cluster. This is a good example of the principle of least privilege. We know that this pod should only be able to access certain IP addresses. So if an attacker were to gain access to this pod, they would not be able to access any resources outside of this IP block, which would limit their ability to kind of spread throughout the cluster and maybe infect other pods or exfiltrate data that they shouldn't have access to. Like Joe said, this is typically something we see people implement later on in their Kubernetes journey. It can get in the way of developer velocity if you don't have a very mature cluster, just because when you're blocking access between pods, folks then need to start thinking about network policy, maybe adjusting network policy as the requirements change over time. But once you do have a mature cluster, applications are fairly well hardened and fairly mature, then it's a good idea to start layering this on to make sure that the blast radius of a particular attack is nicely contained.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it's one of the other things about network policies. It can be, it may require a lot of maintenance over time, especially if your cluster is changing or if you're deploying a lot of new applications. So it is something to think about in terms of how you use it and the maintenance around it as well.
Exactly.
One area that we'll talk about here in terms of Kubernetes security tooling isn't really related to Kubernetes itself, but more container security. And fortunately, container security has been around for quite some time. When it comes to container security, it's really about ensuring your applications and the containers are built in a way that do not contain critical known vulnerabilities. And one of the things that's happening is there's an increasing amount of fire hose of known vulnerability information around containers. It's impossible to be able to solve every single known vulnerability. And so prioritizing which CVEs to fix first and which CVEs are most important to take to monitor becomes some of the challenges that are emerging today. It's also, when it comes to container security, that's a piece of the overall puzzle. You need to make sure your containers are secure while your Kubernetes configurations are secure, and that's why we're including it in this list of important tooling. Now, it's one of the things that's great about the Kubernetes community is there's a lot of free and open source tools. There are also some open source container scanning solutions out there as well. We'll highlight a couple in just a second. On the next slide, what we'll show you is a little bit of where you can get container security today. The first area is really the CI pipeline. So that's one area where a lot of organizations try to integrate container scanning so that they can shift security left, move it closer to the developer who may be responsible for building the container and allowing you to avoid introducing known vulnerabilities at the earliest point in the process. Another area is really at the image registry. And this is increasingly, container scanning is increasingly a feature of image registries, allowing you to get visibility into which container risks may exist as part of your existing portfolio of containers. And finally, there's an increasing amount of integration with the cluster. So we talked about the need to prioritize container vulnerabilities. Having some information around which containers are running in your cluster and if those containers may have suddenly been exposed to a new CVE, those are some use cases that are beginning to emerge to ensure that you're having additional defense in depth around your container security strategy. Like I mentioned earlier, there are some great free and open source options. One of them is a solution called Trivi, which is maintained by Aqua Security. And one of the great things about Trivi is it's a simple and easy to install solution that can run also in your CI process. It's also very fast and comprehensive, and it provides information for the developer on which version certain libraries have and vulnerabilities have been fixed in. So what we wanted to do today is just give you a quick demo of this container scanning solution and give you a sense of how it works so you can go ahead and try it yourself.
Cool. So we can scan both images that are local and images that are contained in a registry. So here we can check the Alpine 3.10.0 image, which is contained remotely in a I believe, a Quay registry, or a Docker Hub registry rather. And we can see that there's a high severity CVE on I think it's called Muscle. There's a medium on OpenSSL and a low on OpenSSL. We can see the CVE IDs over here. We can see the version that's affected here. We can see the version that it's fixed in over here, as well as some additional information about the CVE. We can also check a later version. I think it's 3.10.5. If we look at the latest version of Alpine 3.10, we can see that these CVEs have been fixed. Typically what you'll see with these widely used images is that if you upgrade to the latest patch version, the CVEs have been fixed. And just as an aside, we generally will recommend that folks unpin the patch version. This will make sure that you are always on the latest patch of that particular image that you're using, as long as they're using Semver in their image tags. So you can see the latest 3.10 here is equivalent to the 3.10.5 and does not have any security vulnerabilities. Interesting to note that if you wanted to add this to a CI/CD pipeline, you can set this exit code parameter. And if there are vulnerabilities, did I get it wrong? If there are vulnerabilities, it will exit with an exit code that you specify here, so that your CI pipeline will break if you run this command and there are vulnerabilities found.
That's great to know. So it looks like a great open source project for doing some of that ad hoc image scanning, as well as integrating to your CI process, which is one of the 3 main use cases for container scanning.
Exactly, yeah.
Awesome. So the 5th category here that we wanted to share is one that's called configuration validation. And this is sort of an emerging category that's becoming increasingly important with Kubernetes. So we talked about how securing your containers is an important step in the previous slide here. Being able to ensure that the configurations that govern how those containers run in Kubernetes, that's another area of additional potential risk. So when it comes to your deployment manifests, these are essentially the configurations that, again, describe how the container runs in Kube. They expose a variety of security settings. And some of these security settings could leave workloads exposed to additional risk if not properly locked down. And there's an emerging category of configuration validation software that packages in a variety of tools to make it easy for DevOps teams to collaborate across these types of challenges, as well as audit their deployment configs. So on the next slide, we'll actually share with you a tool. Again, this is one that Fairwinds has developed and maintained called Polaris. So you can get this tool for free. It's open source via our GitHub repo, but it will allow you to audit all of the deployments in your cluster and check to see if they're aligned with best practices. A big portion of those best practices are going to be security checks. So there are, an example might be, is that container designed to run as root? And many times a container may not need root access when it's running in your cluster, but oftentimes developers or DevOps folks may end up configuring it to run as root just to get it to run and verify that it's working. So that's an area where some additional hardening of the configuration can become very important. So what we'd like to do is share with you a brief demo of the Polaris tool. Again, this is something that you could use today to get some visibility into your cluster, and I'll turn it over to Robert for that demo.
Cool. So I've got Polaris installed here. I'll just run the dashboard. Browser. So you can see the Polaris dashboard running here on on my local machine. And we can see everything that's basically running inside of the cluster right now. For instance, we've got an instance of Grafana here, and we can see there's a few problems with this instance of Grafana, the way I've configured it. CPU limits haven't been set, memory requests haven't been set, so we've got some resource issues that could yield problems here. We also noticed that the file system is not read-only, which can cause some security issues. If an attacker were able to modify the local file system. But we can see, we've done some other best practices with our configuration. We're not allowed to escalate privileges. We have readiness and liveness probes set. The container is not running as root. It doesn't have access to the host port. We specified an image tag to make sure that we're not just pulling the latest at all times, not using any insecure capabilities. So these are checks that we're running on every single deployment, stateful set, whatever's running in your cluster. We're able to check, basically any kind of pod controller, able to check that its configuration is set securely. There are certain tools like Cert Manager, say, that do have certain permissions that they need in order to do their job. So there are some built-in exemptions that we've created. You can see right now I've got an 88% based on the configured exemptions. But if I disable those exemptions, you can see my score goes down quite a bit. You can see Cert Manager, which had a perfect score before, now has some things wrong with it. For instance, Cert Manager does need to run as root. So we have an exemption configured for Cert Manager to run as root. We can see that without the exemptions enabled, we now get a warning for that. Also interesting to note that Polaris isn't just a dashboard. We can also run it as an audit, which will run locally on the command line. We'll output the results to dev null for now, but we can see, just like Trivi, we can set an exit code anytime our score drops below a certain threshold. So here, we have a score of 88, which is below our configured score of 99, and we've gotten an exit code of 4, which again, if we run this inside of a CI pipeline, the CI pipeline will notice this non-zero exit code and will break, preventing us from actually merging our code. Also worth noting that Polaris can run as a validating webhook inside your cluster, so that if anybody tries to, say, create a deployment that breaks with your configured set of checks, it will reject that deployment. And that is 100% configurable out of our existing checks. You can set which ones should prevent deployments from going in and which ones should still allow deployments to go through. And you can also configure custom checks using JSON schema. You can create checks for, say, a maximum amount of memory you want a particular deployment to use, making sure that certain fields are set to reasonable values. Really anything within the deployment configuration, you can write a custom check to make sure of.
That's great. Thanks, Robert. Yeah, really exciting about some of the different ways you can use Polaris, either just the dashboard to get visibility into what your posture might be today against best practices as a CI integration or even as an admission controller. That's great. The final tool, this is actually sort of a bonus, is Fairwinds Nova. This is actually a brand new open source tool that we released this week. And it falls in the realm of security in the sense of ensuring that you're staying up to date and staying revved up to the more recent versions of popular Kubernetes add-ons. So if you're using Helm charts today to deploy your workloads and your applications, Fairwinds Nova might be a great tool as an extension of staying on top of what the latest versions might be for those different add-ons. And it helps you avoid tech debt, but it also helps you avoid security issues if there have been patches in those add-ons that are related to security. So we wanted to spend just a couple minutes highlighting this tool. Again, it's free, open source, and might be very handy if you're a Helm user. And I'll let Robert just do a quick demo to give you a sense of what it can find.
Yes, so you can see we've got a few Helm charts in here. And Helm will tell us what version we're running, but it won't tell us what the latest version is. So this is why we built Nova. That Nova can tell us not only what's running in the cluster, but it can tell us what's out of date. So you can see a lot of these are out of date. Luckily, I've got the latest Postgres and the latest RBAC Manager since we just installed that. You can see, for instance, metric server is out of date. So I could just run a quick helm update metric server. I'll upgrade metric server rather. This will install the latest metric server in my cluster. That worked. And if I check Nova again, you can see metric server is now not marked as old. You can see the versions match. If I were to revert, upgrade, go back to 2.8.8. Check Nova again. You can see the versions don't match anymore. It's marking old as true. It's also worth noting that for deprecated charts, like my PostgreSQL chart here, even though it's on the latest version, this chart has actually been moved to the Bitnami repo outside of the Helm core repo. And the one that I have installed is actually now deprecated. So Nova has also noticed that this chart is now deprecated and that I should probably move to a different chart. So like Joe said, this is really important for making sure that you're up to date on the latest release. It is difficult to keep track of new releases in Helm charts, and there are security vulnerabilities being found all the time for these charts and for the underlying container images, et cetera. So it's important to keep these up to date as much as possible.
That's great. Thanks, Robert, for sharing that. So we covered today actually 6 different tools, and we realized that the Kubernetes ecosystem is actually, there's dozens and dozens of different security tooling out there. One of the ways that we've thought about helping organizations kind of rationalize what are the different categories of tools is we look at 3 different categories today. We look at first the container side, understanding tools that are related to container scanning and to container security. We talked about Trivi, but there's also other open source tools like Claire out there that are interesting to look at. The second category, deployment configurations, is the one that really is focused on making sure you've configured your workloads with the right security settings. We talked about Polaris, but there's also some great tools out there, one called KubeSec that's interesting to take a look at, and it's focused just on the security checks. And the third category is Kubernetes clusters. So making sure your kublet's configured securely and that the cluster itself isn't configured with any sort of obvious problems. Nova is one we shared, but there's also some great ones from that are maintained by Aqua Security around KubeHunter and KubeBench. And so as Kubernetes makes its way into the more and more companies, these tools become more and more important for how you should think about validating your Kubernetes configurations at scale. So on the next slide, I wanted to just walk through a couple different ways you can think about integrating Kubernetes configuration validation tools into your process. The first area is sort of the CI pipeline area. So we talked about container security and deployment validation with tools like Polaris as ways for you to integrate into your CI workflows. At the cluster side, we can go a step further and add some of those cluster security tools like KubeBench and KubeHunter to give you a sense of what might be misconfigured at the node or kubelet level. And with kind of a defense in depth approach like this, it'll allow you to be able to maintain and stay on top of security best practices for Kubernetes. On the next slide, I just want to walk through, again, what some of the business benefits of a configuration validation strategy can offer an organization. Aside from improving security, you also enables you to reduce cost and save time. And really a lot of the time investment today might be focused on researching these tools, understanding how to configure them, and then setting up a lot of these tools to run on sort of a continuous basis so that you can have that as a repetitive business process. Fortunately, there are some solutions emerging that help with operationalizing a lot of the tools that we went through today so that you can implement some business processes in a more automated fashion. And With that, I'll kind of turn it over to our last slide and just kind of give you a sense of some of the additional resources you can take advantage of. So if you're interested in trying out, a bunch of the tools that we mentioned today and a few more, Fairwinds does have a free trial of a product that we call Fairwinds Insights that helps you with validating your kube configurations. If you're also just looking to learn more about additional security concepts and security tools and resources, we do have a guide here that covers some of the stuff that we talked about today, but goes into more detail around workload identity and best practices for managing secrets as well. So we want to make sure that, as companies embrace Kubernetes, they have the resources, whether it's content or tooling, to, secure their infrastructure. And that's really what we are here to help you with today. So with that said, I think we can open it up for some Q&A, and I want to thank the audience for their time.
All right, great. Yes, we have plenty of time for question and answer period. A question for either Joe or Robert. Please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and get your question on in. We'll go ahead and start with the questions we do have here. Here's one. If you have Calico as the network, then you may not need an additional resource like network policy. Is that right?
Yeah, so there are, networking add-ons like Calico, Istio that can handle things like network policy. I believe generally using their own configurations. So Kubernetes native network policy may not be required if you're using some of these other add-ons.
Okay. All right, great. Let's see here. We have so many great questions here. Okay, here's one. Polaris as CI integration. Can you throw some light or documentation on it? Get some more information, please.
Yeah, so if you go to github.com/fairwindsops/Polaris, that's the open source repo. That has a lot of great documentation on how to run Polaris in CI. But the basic idea is that you can point Polaris to any local files that are in your repository, local YAML files, or you could template out a Helm chart, say, into a YAML file that you can point Polaris to. And Polaris will run all of its checks against those YAML files rather than, say, something running inside of a cluster actively. And then, like I said before, you can configure Polaris to basically say exactly which checks you want to make sure your CI process fails for. You can configure Polaris to fail below a certain score. You can configure Polaris if a certain level of a certain threshold of danger is reached. So it's a highly configurable tool inside the CI context.
All right, excellent. Okay, plenty of time, guys, for questions. So if you have one, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and get it on in. Here's another good one for you. Is Nova more like the system and component version check, or is it anything more?
So Nova is really just checking, as of now, it's just checking Helm charts against what's the latest version of that Helm chart that has been published. We've talked about pushing it forward to say checking for how far out of date a container image is versus what the latest tag is set to, as well as some other ideas that have been thrown around for things that we might be able to check that are out of date. But right now it just focuses on Helm 2 and Helm 3 charts.
All right. Okay, great. Next question. Let's see. RBAC Manager and Polaris are from Fairwinds. Is Trivi also yours?
Yeah, that's a great question. So RBAC Manager and Polaris are projects that Fairwinds developed, and we maintain those today. Trivi is not. Trivi is actually, I think, maintained by Aqua Security. So that is an example of just a great open source solution out there today. One of the things that we at Fairwinds really strongly believe in is the power of the Kubernetes open source community to advance the technology and get organizations up and running, especially around the security side, getting the information and tools they need to secure their infrastructure. So we end up developing some of those tools ourselves when we see that there's a need, but we also use a lot of open source tools in how we deliver our managed services today, as well as in terms of how we recommend to clients. So, while Trivi isn't something that Fairwinds maintains, we think it's a great starting point for container scanning.
All right, excellent. Let's see, next question. Does Polaris need a namespace?
So Polaris runs in a particular namespace, but it will check everything across all namespaces inside of your cluster. So it has access to everything inside of your cluster. You can, within the user interface, filter for a particular namespace, say, so you only want to run, you only want to see the results for one namespace. And you can also, using a command line flag, restrict Polaris to looking at a particular resource inside of your cluster. So you can just check one resource at a time if you're only trying to check on one specific thing.
All right. All right, we have gotten so many great questions in here. Okay, here's one for you. Who or what is the authorization for Polaris's login? Who creates it?
So Polaris doesn't have any authorization mechanism. It just, whoever's running. So basically, Polaris is using the Cubeconfig local to your environment. So if it's, it could be say running inside your cluster with a service account that has access to view the things that Polaris needs to access. We do have a Helm chart and a Kubeconfig for deploying the dashboard inside of your cluster with the necessary RBAC permissions. Or if you have a Kubeconfig specified locally, as I did in this example, you can run the dashboard locally on your machine, and it will use that Kubeconfig to access the cluster. But basically, it will only be able to see the things that Kubeconfig has access to, or that service account has access to.
All right.
Yeah, and I just can add on to that as well. I think if the question's also around, can I manage users who have access to Polaris? We do offer a software as a service offering called Fairwinds Insights that Polaris is a tool that can plug into that offering, and it allows you to set up multiple users, and you can govern which users have access to which clusters to view information like from tools like Polaris. So that might give you an opportunity to roll it out across an organization more widely as well. So there's different ways you can take advantage of Polaris today.
All right, great. Let's see, next question here. Let's see. Oh, here we go. Does Fairwinds validate cloud-based deployments?
So Fairwinds only validates things that are running inside of your cluster. So deployments, stateful sets, jobs, cron jobs, things like that. It's not going to validate, say, your GKE configuration or your AKS configuration.
All right, great. Next question here. For container security in Kubernetes clusters, can you give an example, please, of which tool or is it ad hoc?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So if you want to, so it's important to continuously scan your containers that are running in your cluster, because even if it's made it through the CI/CD process and got pushed into your cluster because there were no vulnerabilities, it's possible that the next day there will be an announcement of a CVE that came up. And now that container is vulnerable, even though it made it through the CI/CD process, because the vulnerability was announced after the CI/CD process, now you're vulnerable. So it's important to scan those images repeatedly, as they're running inside the cluster. There is that I'm aware of, there's no existing open source tool to do that. One way you could do it is to basically write a script internally to pull those images and scan them using Trivi, say, on a local machine using a cron job, or inside a Circle CI using a cron job. We do have in Fairwinds Insights, though, we have a tool that will basically run Trivi on an hourly basis on any containers that are running inside your cluster. So we'll do basically a rolling scan of all containers inside your cluster, and any results, any vulnerable images will get pushed up to the Fairwinds Insights dashboard, and you'll be able to see the live results for containers running inside your cluster. Are they vulnerable or not?
All right, excellent. Okay, we are about 15 minutes to the top of the hour. Still plenty of time for questions. If you have one, go ahead and use that GoToWebinar control panel and submit it. Okay, here's one for you. Let's see. Any thoughts on how these tools might relate to the upcoming CKS certification?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't know, Robert, do you have a perspective on that?
I don't think any of these tools would be covered within CKS, although I haven't seen the actual certification. They definitely cover concepts related to CKS, but I'm not sure if the CKS actually mentions any particular tools by name.
All right, moving along then. Next question. In case Polaris does not require authorization, then can anybody with Cubeconfig see the dashboard?
So this is really, assuming you are running it inside the cluster, it really depends on your Ingress settings. Anybody who can port forward to the pod that Polaris is running on is going to be able to see the dashboard. And you can configure an Ingress, basically however you want to configure an Ingress to allow certain traffic in. You can make the dashboard public, to the world, which you probably don't want to do. Internally at Fairwinds, we have an Ingress policy set up with OAuth, so that somebody needs to basically have they need to OAuth with Google and have an @fairwinds.com email address to see our Polaris dashboard. So you can basically set up that Ingress however you want. If you're running the dashboard locally, then yes, it's basically anybody who has access to a Cubeconfig that allows them to view resources in the cluster can run Polaris as a way of viewing those resources. So if you already have access to view those resources, Polaris is just another way to look at them.
All right, excellent. Oh, here's a good one for you. Where does Falco stand in security?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Falco is one that we didn't cover, but we've heard that come up from customers and as a great security solution as well. My understanding of Falco is it's a really kind of a behavioral monitoring tool, and it's really designed to kind of detect anomalous activity in applications. But what it does is it actually monitors the kernel, is my understanding. And then it enriches some of that information with container runtime metrics, kube metrics, et cetera. So I think it's a pretty powerful tool. I think it's been in the community for quite some time. We didn't cover it today. I've heard some good things about it, but it is kind of focused more on monitoring the activity in the runtime.
Okay, all right, great. Let's see. Here's one for you. If there are any images with CVE that doesn't have a fix yet, what do you do?
That's a really good question, and it's a really tough one. So one possibility is to just bug the maintainers, let them know that this container is vulnerable. Another possibility is to basically create a new Docker file with that container as the base image, and to try installing on top of it the latest versions of whatever packages are vulnerable. And another possibility is to try to change the base image of the container, which is usually where, so if you already control the Docker file, say changing the base image, say from Alpine to maybe you can try running from scratch, try a more pared down version. So like a lot of base images are built on something like Ubuntu, whereas Alpine might be a little more appropriate, a little bit more pared down. It can be a rabbit hole of trying to squash that CVE and get past it. It can take a lot of work. There's no set process really. It's a lot of just trying to figure out what the best way to go about it is. There are many different ways to figure out that problem.
All right, excellent. Well, we are about 11 minutes to the top of the hour. I think we have time for 2 more questions. How about this one? What is the first thing I should do to secure a Kubernetes cluster?
That is a good question. Hey, Robert, you want me to kind of kick that off?
Go right ahead, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, there's obviously, with today's presentation, there's a number of tools, a number of concepts to look at. I think in terms of one of the things to familiarize yourself with is, in my opinion, and I'd love to get Robert your point of view, is just kind of start by looking at how to configure your deployments, making sure that they are following sort of security best practices. There are a number of different defense in depth things that you may want to do, but Robert, I'd love to get your point of view.
Yeah, I think personally that RBAC is far and away the most important thing to do on day one. We see a lot of people decide to basically skip the step of applying RBAC, and they'll basically just grant cluster admin rules to cluster admin permissions to everybody using the cluster and every service account in the cluster. And that's a great way to shoot yourself in the foot. RBAC is not that difficult to set up, and at least set up some sane defaults around RBAC. So that would be my first step, is to set up RBAC.
All right. Here's a good one. Another good one for you. What tool would you recommend for testing against the CIS Kubernetes benchmark?
Ooh, that's a good one. So there is a really good tool out there called KubeBench. It's actually, we didn't get to cover it today. I think we mentioned it in the presentation. What it does is it implements the CIS Kubernetes benchmark specification and then runs checks against that to tell you where you may be passing or failing. I think that's one of the more well-regarded tools for the CIS Kubernetes benchmark, which is a great way to get a sense of, is my cluster configured and hardened in some of them in a way that's aligning with best practices. It's actually one of the tools that we also include in our Fairwinds Insights offering if you're looking to deploy and use that pretty quickly.
Okay, great. All right, let's slip one more in and then we'll close it out. What roles or teams are typically responsible for keeping Kubernetes clusters secure?
That's a really good question. It really falls across three different types of roles, I would say. The first is the developers themselves. I would say typically developers are not as security oriented as say DevOps teams or security teams, but it's important to educate your development teams on security best practices, especially security best practices around Kubernetes, which is a really difficult and big subject. So that's kind of your first line of defense security wise. Then I would say the burden typically falls between security teams and DevOps teams. The tough thing here is that security teams tend not to know a lot about Kubernetes, and DevOps teams often don't know enough about security. So it's important to get a lot of good back and forth between those two teams. Typically, you're going to have security teams doing analysis and auditing, whereas the DevOps teams are going to be responsible for actually implementing new security tools, making sure they're applied throughout the cluster, etc.
All right. Well, we're about 7 minutes to the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and close out the question and answer period. We have so many great questions, and if we didn't get to yours, I apologize, but I kind of want to give Joe and Robert a little bit of a break now since we've gone through so many questions. So please know that the folks at Fairwinds will be getting a copy of all of the questions. So if we didn't get to your question during the presentation, I'm sure somebody from their organization will be more than happy to follow up with you. Also, I want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the presentation, or if you just want to watch it again, you will have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. And while you're there, please feel free to check out all of the webinars we have, both upcoming and on demand. Hopefully there'll be 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 that pique your interest. Okay, I mentioned at the top of the hour that we would be doing a drawing for 6 $25 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and do that. Our first winner today is Ben H. Congratulations, Ben. Our second winner today is Christine H. Congratulations, Christine. Our third winner today is Edward V. Congratulations, Edward. Our fourth winner today is John P. Congratulations, John. Our fifth winner today is Sandy T. Congratulations, Sandy. And our sixth and final winner today is Simon C. Congratulations, Simon. Please check your email, guys, for an email from us regarding your Amazon gift card. If you don't see it in your inbox, please check your spam folder. Joe and Robert, thank you for a great presentation. Lots of interesting stuff. I really enjoy watching the demos. Lots of really interesting things. So thank you so much for your time, for your expertise, and look forward to the next webinar with you guys.
Thank you.
All right. Also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.